So welcome everybody. I'm Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society. Of course, I'm the historian here at the Adams County Historical Society. I always like to tell people too, I'm the Adams County historian, which that's two totally different, unrelated things, believe it or not. Today's program is something that I've done I've done this for a few years. I did this program years ago, and so I dusted it off and brought it back out, and I've never done it for a YouTube presentation. So excuse me if I don't remember exactly what I'm going to say at different points, or I'm sure I'll be all right though. So Tillie Pierce wrote one of the most comprehensive civilian experiences of the battle. She was born in 1848, so she was 15 years old at the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. And we're fortunate that in her book, she put a photograph of herself from the time that, she was from, I guess it says from 1863. It would really be neat to see the original photograph and see the back mark on the photograph, because this is the only version of it we have, is the version that comes from her book. In the introduction of her book, she gives a little bit of background about why she wrote it. And it was written in 1888, around the 25th anniversary of the battle. And I should mention that, we have a huge collection of accounts here at the Adams County Historical Society of the civilians during the battle. We have diaries of civilians. We have letters written by civilians in 1863. We have newspaper articles that they wrote in later years. We have interviews where reporters interview civilians during the battle. We have accounts by soldiers that talk about their interaction with civilians during the battle. So counting those all together, I generally say we have 300 accounts by or about civilians. And almost none of them are by children. And so we do have books written by Tillie Pierce, Charles McCurdy, Daniel Skelly, Leander Warren, who were youngsters at the time of the battle. But the articles or booklets are written years later. So what we're basically talking about is children's accounts of the battle where adults are looking back at when they were children and how they viewed the battle. And I always like to point that out when we're talking about these children's accounts. Let me see. And a couple things that she mentions in her foreword. She talks about how she wanted to record her experience. And let me say just right away that her experiences of the battle are very honest. And that's one thing I really appreciate about her account. She's not hiding how she feels about things that happened. She's not trying to make herself look better than, she tells you when she was scared, and she tells you when she was confused, and, some things come out in her account that I don't like. I would say, again, just so you know this ahead of time, I don't like Tillie Pierce. I don't find her particularly likable. But boy, do I like her account. And boy, do I agree it's one of the best accounts of the battle by a civilian that we have. I don't think we would be friends. But, what's interesting about it is the things I always tell people. She says in her book, nor is it with any desire she's talking about herself, to be classed among the heroines of that period, that these lines are written, but simply to show what many a patriotic and loyal girl would have done if surrounded by similar circumstances. And this is something I try to get across to people. When I talk about them, I don't want you to imagine that all the civilians of the battle are heroes or heroines. I want you to imagine that these are everyday people that are put into a position that they don't want to be in, that they didn't ask to be in, that they're shocked to be in, and they deal with it the way anybody would deal with it. Some people deal with it better than others, but the situation, it's not like everyone is a hero or everyone, is a heroine. It's just this is what happened to them, and you can read about them. Now, I have noticed that there's a tendency to refer as Tillie Pierce as a heroine. She simply wrote about what happened. And why is the writer of the account a hero or heroine? It just doesn't make any sense to me. There's another thing in her book that she tries to get across to people, and I'm not sure how many people are aware of it, that after the Battle of Gettysburg was over and reporters came into the town, a lot of reporters focused on the civilians and how they were unpatriotic or how they were cowardly, and it's almost, there are a couple reasons for it. It was a juxtaposition between the soldiers and the civilians, and also it was the idea that South Central Pennsylvania was predominantly Democratic during the war and wasn't as supportive of the war effort as maybe some other states, and the newspapers are sending these reporters. So there was a tendency to pick on the local people that they weren't doing all they could after the battle. Of course, there's 2,000 people and 20,000 wounded soldiers and no supplies. What are you going to do? And then you got all these reporters coming into town who demand a place to stay and a place to eat, when all that, this place to stay and eat, that should be for wounded soldiers, not for, gawkers and sightseers that are coming in by the thousands. So there was a general disagreement as to what the people in the town should be catering to after the battle. But she says this in her introduction: "Let those disposed to cavil and doubt the patriotism of the citizens of Gettysburg at the time of the battle forever cease, for what I have written is correct. True, it is that there were a few who sympathized with the South, just as in any other northern town. But it would be unjust and unreasonable to condemn the many for the misdeeds of a few." And of course there, I think she's kind of talking about Jenny Wade. We'll get into that later. But, that's interesting that, this book, when it came out, was widely read by soldiers who were in the battle. And it's just really a good synopsis of the civilian experience, and people appreciated it. So Tillie lived at a house on Baltimore Street. And of course the house still stands, and today it's a bed and breakfast. So you could check out her house if you want. We also do have a photograph of Tillie Pierce that, I haven't looked at it for a while, so I don't know the original source of the photograph, but it appears in much of the stuff that's been written about her in more recent years. It's not like we have other writings of Tillie Pierce. We have the book, and I'll talk about that. So I thought in my program, since I know a lot about the people who live here, I'd add some things to her story that maybe you're not aware of. Now, I want to talk about a couple things. First of all, the book was originally printed in 1888, and we have 2 original copies of her book in our collection. And these original copies are few and far between. And one of our copies is in the J. Howard Wirt collection. So he has a bunch of these little booklets that were written by Gettysburg civilians. And I probably first saw this booklet when I started volunteering here at the Society in 1989. And you can see J. Howard Wirt wrote an explanation of the booklets in his collection, which I really appreciate. And he mentions things. And he says, this is an interesting and very readable little book by one with whom I was personally an intimately acquainted from childhood. So he's a little older than her, so I don't know how intimately he's, associated with her. He's probably 10 years older than her. So, but J. Howard Wirt obviously liked her book and wrote that at the time it came out. So again, 1888. But here's what I'm going to tell you. The book was reprinted in 1889. And today, all of you guys have read the 1889 version of the book. And it might surprise you to find out the 1888 version's just a little bit different. And I'll point out some differences in the illustrations here as we go along. But this version of the book, and I don't know how many copies of the 1889 book were printed or how read it was, but definitely people coming to the battlefield were able to buy it and see it. So here is our local newspaper, the Star and Sentinel, in 1889, that talks about the book being published, and it's a nice little review. We also have a Gettysburg Compiler article about the book being published, and they mention Tillie Pierce Alleman, and they talk about how she's at the Weikert farm on the Tawnytown Road, and give some information. One of the controversial things when it came out was her explanation of the death of General Weed and the spot that he died. That people, it differs from the historical narratives we have of his death. Although, it's not uncommon for us to have conflicting information about the details of his death. So, of anybody's death on the battlefield. So she says he was wounded and died at the Weikert farm on the Tawnytown Road. And she has a conversation, she says, with him. Is it him? Is not him? I don't know. Also, I wanted to throw this out that maybe you don't realize, is that Tillie Pierce visited Gettysburg. She had married and moved away, but she visited in 1913 at the 50th anniversary of the battle. And I found this article in the Harrisburg Telegraph describing how she came to the 50th anniversary of the battle and met with soldiers and talked to them, and was enough to have an article about her in the paper from her visit. So if you didn't know that. Now, most of us know about Tillie Pierce's account because it was reprinted by Butternut and Blue in 1988. And William Frastinito, of course, who's like one of my best friends, he wrote an introduction to it. And it was published and it was printed in great quantities. And eventually Stan Clark here in Gettysburg got the rights to it, and it was reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. So this is how we know about it. Not because of the 1888 version or the 1889 version, because in 1987, it was printed in Baltimore. And this is the book that you find around town and you can buy, So, if anybody wants to pick up a copy. I think, I'm not sure if the Gettysburg Antique Center has closed down completely yet. Do you know where that is on Baltimore Street? Because, they're closing at that location. But Stan Clark has a stand there, and he usually sells them for half price. Of course, he raises the price a little bit and then makes them half off. That's Stan Clark. I hope he sees this. And Stan Clark, at one time, he actually lived in the Jacob Weikert farm house. He's a great guy. But I just wanted to point out that, so in 1987 or 1988, because, I knew Fraz, and, that's when I read the book. And so, I'm sure that many of us here. And Fraz has a nice introduction in it. And in the introduction, he talks about things that are mentioned in the book and then gives more detail to those things, which are really, really, really insightful. He says, roughly 80 eyewitness accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg are known to have been written by local Gettysburg residents during the days, years, and decades following the great events of July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Of course, this is before I started collecting all these accounts, and now we have hundreds of them. Without question, among the most outstanding of these accounts was written by Tillie Pierce Alleman. At Gettysburg, or What a Girl Saw and Heard of the Battle, a True Narrative, published privately in 1888. So scarce is this booklet today that only a handful of original copies are known to exist. And if you count the 1888 and the 1889 versions, I think we have 5 of them, originals. And then he says at the end of his description, his write-up, although Tillie Pierce's Alleman's account of the Battle of Gettysburg was written 25 years after the event, it remains a classic. And in the truest sense of the word, it will long provide scholars with a treasure trove of details to be examined and analyzed well into the future, or as long, at least, as one person remains who is concerned with what a girl saw and heard of the battle. I just think that's great. And I should mention that in more recent years, and you can see 2015 at the bottom, the Shriver House at Gettysburg got a hold of the original book. And I don't know if they had bought them from, the rights from Stan Clark, although really the rights were only for the introduction by William Frassanito. So they reprinted the book in kind of the same format to make it look like and again, this 1980s version of the book, the cover is nothing like it was originally done. It just is a more modern version. But they, and I haven't never talked to Bill about this, and I'm assuming because Bill had the copyright over his introduction, they decided to rewrite the introduction. And so Nancy at the Shriver House rewrote the introduction to the booklet and inserted a whole bunch of stuff about George Shriver because, obviously it's published by the Shriver House. So today, you can go to the Shriver House, which of course the Adams County Historical Society now owns and operates, and you can buy Tillie Pierce's booklet with an introduction in it by Nancy Gudmanstead, who owned the Shriver House for many years. Also, I'd like to mention that Woody Christ wrote a lot about Tillie Pierce. And basically, as I remember, what had happened was in the 1980s, when, again, I really started to work in the area of history here in Gettysburg, the Tillie Pierce house, the James Pierce house, her father, was an apartment complex, and it was separated into a bunch of apartments. And Craig Hafner purchased it in the early 1990s. Craig Hafner was the producer of Civil War Journal. He was a Hollywood producer. He did a bunch of things. He did The Real West with Kenny Rogers. He opened up Greystone's American History Store on Baltimore Street. And he bought the Tillie Pierce house. If I remember correctly, his daughter really liked Tillie Pierce, had read her account. I don't know what they were planning to do with the house, but Woody was hired, who, again, he was a historian here at the Adams County Historical Society. He has since passed away. But he was hired to write a comprehensive history of the Witherow Breckenridge Pierce house, he calls it. So he wrote a history of the house, and he delved into the story of Tillie Pierce and her book. And I accompanied him on his research trips to Selinsgrove and Snyder County, Pennsylvania, where Tillie moved to, and Tillie died, I think in 1914, and she's buried in Selinsgrove. So a lot of information that I know about that story originally came from my association with Woody. Now, you probably know that after the Civil War, Tillie married. She married in, is it 1871? I'm sure it says here somewhere near the bottom. Oh, yeah. Married at the very bottom, September 28th, 1871, to Tillie Pierce. So Horace Alleman. And he was from Harrisburg, and he went to Gettysburg College. And she obviously met him at Gettysburg College. They were married in Gettysburg, and then she ended up moving with him to Selinsgrove. And here she is. This is her tombstone in a cemetery in Selinsgrove. She died in 1917. Now, her parents are buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Gettysburg, James and Margaret Pierce. So a little bit about her family. Her father is James Pierce, we believe born in Maryland, probably Baltimore, Maryland, in 1806. And you can see he died in 1896. And you can visit his grave in Evergreen Cemetery. We do not know who his parents are. And I've never really attempted to research James Pierce. I'm from Baltimore. I know the Baltimore records really well. You think I should maybe look into it, but I have never. And I'm not certain or aware if there are other, genealogists in the Pierce family that have researched the name. Part of the problem, I'm going to show you real quick here, is I don't know what his last name is. It's spelled so many different ways. But there's a couple things we do know. In the 1880 census, he mentions that he's from Maryland. And of course, I don't know if you're aware of this. The 1880 census is the first time when they asked you the question, where is your father born? Where is your mother born? And he says his father's born in London and his mother's from Maryland. So that's our big clue. So according to his obituary, he was a native of Maryland and came here from Baltimore with John McFarland when he was 21 years of age. For many years, he carried on butchering on the property where he died. John McFarland. Do you know what property he built in the town of Gettysburg? The Farnsworth House in 1833. And John McFarland is a butcher. And of course, Tillie Pierce's father, James Pierce, becomes a butcher. And what's really interesting to me, and I don't know how many people have picked this up, but here's the John McFarland dies, and the Gettysburg Bank buys his property, and they own it for a few years, and eventually they sell it to Harvey Sweeney, who owns it at the time of the battle. But across the street where Mr. G's is, John Weinbrenner's house, if this is Lefevre Street, and this is the old Baltimore Shippensburg Road that goes up off of Baltimore Street. And you see this? James Percy, or Piercy. That's Tillie Pierce's father. And it's obvious that John McFarland's son Samuel buys a slaughterhouse that is located between McCreary and Weinbrenner's properties. And so the McFarlands own that, and undoubtedly that's a slaughterhouse and a butchering stand. This is the 1850 map of the town. And I don't know if a lot of people have realized that he owns, Tillie Pierce's dad owns that property. It's shown on the Warren map of the battlefield, this little property over here. And, with that X, that's a residence. I wonder if, Pierce lived there before he bought the Pierce house on Baltimore Street. That's what I'm imagining. And we'll talk about that. He bought that in 1847. So this might be his residence. And and, you know, the slaughterhouse. You probably want to move away and not live in the slaughterhouse area. You want to have it somewhere else, not near your house. This is really an industrial area of town. Harvey Sweeney was a butcher. I thought that he butchered in the big barn and shed behind his house, but maybe, you know, he and Pierce operated together for a while. This is a brickyard. This is a tannery, and that is a tannery. Just a really stinky part of town. So James Pierce, and again, you know, we have this thing in his obituary. He came here in 1821, but he's definitely here by 1830 from the records. So I think he first appears in the tax records for Cumberland Township in 1827. But here you can find articles in the paper about him. This is actually 1830. It's hard to see the way it's written there. But there is James Piercy. And in most all the early records, he has a Y on his name, Piercy. So you see how, again, if it's spelled like 4 or 5 different ways, how am I supposed to figure out who this guy is in Baltimore early on? But here you can see he's one of the commanders of the Gettysburg Guards, a militia unit that is assembling here in 1830. And also, here he's part of the Temperance Beneficial Association of Gettysburg. Oh, I didn't put the date of that, but I think that's like 1847. And you can see he's like the first name on the Temperance Committee list there. And in 1835, James Piercy, look how it's spelled there, is married to Margaret McCurdy. I don't know when they changed her name to Pierce, you know, but it's obvious that it's spelled a bunch of different ways early on. And again, that's going to just make it really hard to figure out more about his family. Maybe it's just maybe the E on the end is just, you know, they pronounce it like a Y. Instead of Pierce, Piercy, maybe that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. Now, Margaret McCurdy is a Gettysburg, entrenched in Gettysburg, and she's born and raised in Gettysburg. We'll talk about that in a moment. Here's the 1840 census, and there's James Piercy. Do you see how John F. McFarland is his next door neighbor there? That makes a lot of sense. I bet she's living in that little house that, of course, would be, you drive through the middle of his house when you're on your way to the middle school. You know, it's just beyond the intersection of the old Shippensburg Road. Do you think about that when you drive, that you're passing through a spot where somebody lived? If you're into ghosts, that must be really bad for you. Yeah. Solomon Powers. How about that? Solomon Powers lives somewhere down there. He doesn't buy the Powers house on High Street until the 1840s. 1843, I think. And then, of course, he owns that hill south of town on the Baltimore Pike. But he lives somewhere there in South Baltimore Street at the time. Solomon Powers could be helping McCreary at the brickyard because he's a granite cutter. So that's always what I imagined. So here's James Pierce's family. We talked about Margaret McCurdy and the 4 children that lived to adulthood. James Shaw Pierce, William Henry Harrison Pierce, and you can see 1836 to 1909, 1841 to 1908. Margaret Ann Pierce, Tillie's sister, who died, young. She died right after the Civil War. And then Matilda Jane, Tillie Pierce, who, that's interesting. They got a different date. I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't know the exact date of her birth, but 48, 49. So I wanted to mention, did you know Tillie Pierce actually filled out the forms and was a daughter of the American Revolution? And according to the lineage book, you have Tillie Pierce, born in Gettysburg, and then she gives her lineage back to Robert McCurdy, on her mother's side, of course, who was a lieutenant and captain in Lancaster County militia. And then he ended up moving to Adams County after the war. And the McCurdy family, Robert McCurdy, owned a huge chunk of land down the Emmitsburg Road, I think 350 acres or so. Today, that land would be the Eisenhower Inn, the All-Star Sports Pavilion. Do you know there's a little schoolhouse that you pass on your way there if you're going down the road on the right, little schoolhouse? So maybe he owns part of what is the farmhouse, restaurant, barn, that property. That schoolhouse is often referred to as McCurdy Schoolhouse. But that's where the McCurdys generated. And then, of course, this guy's son James moved into Gettysburg, lived in Gettysburg, and then, of course, his daughter is Margaret. So, and she grew up in Gettysburg. Now, her parents, I think, does he have it here? Yeah, James McCurdy. Her father died in the 1830s when she relatively young. And then she married James Pierce like a year later. But she would have been a native of Baltimore Street, born and raised and lived on Baltimore Street. Now, a couple things about her children. James Shaw Pierce. Oh, I wanted to mention that there are other children that did not survive to, beyond childhood. And this is common in families. And I don't know how many people are aware of this, so I thought I'd put this in the show. But I don't know if there's more children. I just happened to find 3 death notices for children of James Piercy, just about 5 weeks, an infant son. I think in one record, somebody suggests that guy's name is Franklin. I forget exactly if that's on the, I don't know where that comes from, but, I've seen that. And then we have Margaret Jane, a daughter who died at age 6. And then over here, where do we have this one? Oh, yeah. Marion Castleberry, daughter of James Pierce. Castleberry, I'll bet you that's good. That's a clue to his English roots, I'll bet. But daughter of James Pierce, and she's 10 months? So you generally, we know about these families from the Civil War because we see them in the census and we see who their children are. But generally, families had children that died young. Oh, you know what I was going to tell you here, and I didn't? In Tillie's book, she mentions, her father probably still has that slaughterhouse even after they live on Baltimore Street because he's shown on the 1850 map with it. And I don't know when they end up selling it, but there's that Baltimore Shippensburg Road that goes out towards Culp's Hill. And in her book, in the beginning, she mentions, "Fondly do I cherish the scenes of my childhood. Often do I think about the lovely groves on and around Culp's Hill, of the mighty boulders which there abound, upon which often I spread a picnic feast. And now the famous Spangler Spring where we drank the cooling draught of those peaceful summer days. There too are merry peals of laughter mingled with the sweet warbling of the birds. What pleasant times were ours as we went berrying along the quiet, sodded lane that leads from the town to that now memorable hill." I imagine berrying means gathering up berries, in case you didn't know what berrying might be. Now, and then later in her book, she says that across that peaceful lane would charge the brave and daring Louisiana tigers, thirsting for their brother's blood, but soon to be hurled back, filling the space over which they advanced with their shattered and dead bodies. Such is a transition which in my girlhood days I was made to realize. And I think that's a big part of her book. I'm not going to read the details of her account from her book. Well, I am somewhat, but not all of them. So you might want to read the book. And to me, what I take away from it is this just a normal, everyday girl that was forced to grow up a little quicker than she wanted to. And that's that she's seeing things that, she cannot unsee and believes that other people, you shouldn't be seeing. Okay. So her brother, James Shaw Pierce, was in Company K, 1st Pennsylvania Reserves. Now, he wasn't at the Battle of Gettysburg. He had gotten sick and was in a hospital in Washington, D.C. during the battle. But her brother is in the unit that fought not far from where she is positioned during the battle at the Wakert Farm. And he's buried in Evergreen Cemetery. Oh, no, he's buried in Virginia. Her other brother, oh no, I got him mixed up. So he is buried in Evergreen Cemetery. You can see that tombstone next to his parents in Evergreen Cemetery. Her other brother, William Henry Harrison Pierce, is also in the military. And let me just point out this first. William Henry Harrison Pierce. Do you think that James Pierce is a Republican? I love when you name your children after one of the candidates, because then you know what political party they represent. And also, let me throw this at you. Look at that date. He's born on March 3rd, 1841. Do you know what happened on March 4th, 1841? Inauguration Day. And William Henry Harrison gave, at that time, the longest speech in inaugural history and caught a cold and died a month later. So I've kind of figured that he was a supporter of Harrison. And so here's William Henry Harrison. And this is from the 1840 newspaper, a Harrison meeting. And who might be listed as being at that meeting? So if you had any doubt. So big fan of William Henry Harrison. Tippy Canoe. Yeah. Yeah. I love that kind of stuff where you can confirm this by looking in the newspaper. And again, one thing that I was doing early on, I don't know a lot of people were doing, I'm not looking for James Pierce. I'm looking for James Piercy. All the early records, he's got the Y. So William Henry Harrison Pierce was in Company M, I believe it is, 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And that is a unit, you can see the names of the other Gettysburg guys in that unit. There he is. And this is a unit that served in the Western armies. And here they are, some of the men. We have their regimental history in our library. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jacob Kitzmiller, we have his sword on display downstairs in the Civil War case. And one of his relatives lives in Gettysburg. But a Balzer Benner, he's buried in the Evergreen Cemetery. I think he died of disease. But here they are at Lookout Mountain. You ever been on that rock? It's awesome. Yeah, I had my picture taken up there. So there he is in the cemetery. Margaret Ann Maggie Pierce, who we mentioned, Tillie's sister, little older sister, she died in 1867, and she's buried in Evergreen Cemetery. So you can see her grave also if you're interested in it. So the house on Baltimore Street, they purchased in 1847. And the house, according to Woody's massive study on the history of the house, is thought to have been built in 1829. And eventually, it was purchased in the early 1830s by a Breckinridge, William Breckinridge. And William Breckinridge, of course, that's why we call it Breckinridge Street. But I think Breckinridge didn't buy it until he was like in his 80s. And I think he bought it and then died a year later. And then it was in the hands of his heirs for many years. So people ask that all the time. Is Breckinridge Street called that because of Vice President Breckinridge that runs for president in the 1860 election? No. A guy named Breckinridge lived there in this house when they laid out that street, originally called Church Street, and then changed to Breckinridge Street. So it was built in 1829. They bought it in 1847, the Pierces, from the heirs of Breckinridge. And here is the family in the 1850 census. So you can see, and they also had, he's a guardian for two Keckler girls whose parents had died, I remember. But you can see Butcher, $3,000 worth of property. At some point, and I don't remember off the top of my head when it is, I'm thinking about 1861, he purchased the property associated with the Alexander Dobbin house. So at the time of the battle, James Pierce owns the Dobbin house also, and a huge piece of land around it. He also owns the house on Breckenridge Street that was built in the 1850s. The first house on the left when you pass the alley beyond the Pierce house. Just for, knowledge if, anybody's curious about this. And here is the 1850 map of the town. So we have, the estate of Allison. That's the Garlack house where Anna Garlack lived. And of course, there's no houses between those two. The Shriver house is not built yet on this map. And so here's the James Percy house. Doesn't it seem like it says Percy? And here's, what we know that is his slaughterhouse back there. So there's Breckenridge Street. And here's just something crazy. I don't think I expected to find this, in 1853, he opens up a public bathing establishment in Gettysburg, James Pierce. And do you know the lots that Alexander Dobbin laid out on Baltimore Street are called spring lots? And it's obvious looking at the Borough Council records that the people along there have problems with water. Water is just bubbling up out of the ground. And so he decides to take advantage of that. And I have no idea what these things would look like, how they were arranged, but he's got both a plunge and a shower bath. So imagine just a big pool of water, and then he's got something hooked up so you can take a shower. And then what he wants you to do is subscribe to being a member of the bathing establishment. So you pay to use it, and then he has all these rules about when you could take a bath, and men and women are not allowed to take baths together. They're open between the hours of 6 and 9 a.m., in the morning, and gentlemen aren't allowed to use it until after 10 o'clock. Women get to use it first. And then, he's got all this. There's something in here that you're not allowed to have more than a few people in the bathhouse at one time. I'd imagine running a bathhouse is very complicated, Okay, so the weirdest thing I think I'm going to show you today about the Pierces. So they run a bathhouse. I don't know how long it ran for or how long it was there, but it was started in 1853. And it could have been, it's probably, I wonder what it smelled like next to the slaughterhouse. Or maybe that's why I'm thinking he still has the slaughterhouse down, on Baltimore Street, South Baltimore Street, across from the Farnsworth house, and then he's just butchering. That's his butcher shop up there on top of the hill. I'm sure the smells of the town in 1863 or something that we really don't want to talk about or experience. So here's the 1860 census. The same, you can see the same. And boy, he's got $6,000 of real estate. So he's doing pretty well. At that time, usually a house like the Pierce house is probably valued at like $2,000. So, he's got, of course, by this time, he may already have the Dobbin house in that Conrad Snyder, who had owned it, had died in 1860. So here is the area that we're talking about, Breckenridge Street and Baltimore Street in the Warren map of the battlefield, which tends to show the properties about the time of the Civil War. This is actually surveyed in 1868, 1869. It's not the best map for showing how large a property is. They make some mistakes. Like they're showing the slaughterhouse as a house instead of a, outbuilding. or the butcher shop. Let's call it the butcher shop. Yeah. And then, of course, by this time, this is the George Shriver house, and this is the bowling alley, the 80-foot-long bowling alley attached to the back of the house. And you can see there's no house between the George Shriver house and the Pierce house. But there's a house here today, and, of course, there's a house here today. But you get the idea what they look like. Now, I wanted to mention that when the war breaks out, of course, in the fall of 1861, the Porter Guards come to Gettysburg. They're the 10th New York Cavalry. We're talking about some 700 men are stationed in Gettysburg, and eventually they build wooden barracks out near the giant grocery store, the same site that would later be Camp Letterman. And but at first, there's no place to put these guys up. So one of the companies of the Porter Guards actually stays in the bowling alley of the Shriver house. A company stays in the courthouse, one stays at a warehouse downtown, one stays at a carriage factory. But, you know, a company of men at that time would probably be about 70 men. And so for a while in December and January of 1861, 1862, there were a unit actually in the bowling alley. You probably know the story. I'm not going to get into it, but George Shriver built the house, and he was going to open up a saloon and bowling alley, but then never did. And then, of course, joined the Army. So here's an interesting thing. In January 1862, this notice in the newspaper mentions that Pierce Cadore and Company, so he's in business with the Cadories. And yes, that's Nicholas Cadore. And yes, Nicholas Cadore eventually has a slaughterhouse out in the fields near Pickett's Charge. I remember that he originally had a slaughterhouse on York Street behind his house, and the borough made him move it out of town. And so in 1876, I think it was, he builds a slaughterhouse in the fields of Pickett's Charge. But I didn't realize until I'd seen this that they're in business together. And you see that they are providing meat for the Porter Guards in this notice. I think that's fascinating. So just a little bit about her father. And in 1863, at the courthouse, because of the invasion, on June 20th, 1863, David McConaughey actually organizes a group of scouts to go around and find out information about the Southern invasion. And basically what we're doing is we are pretending we are older men, and then we ride down the street and count units and battle flags and artillery pieces and relate that information back, and then it's telegraphed by David McConaughey to Harrisburg, and he provides valuable information. And so, you know, James Pierce, I think, is 55 years old at this time, and he's on the list somewhere. I don't remember where. I obviously put him on here. Do you guys see him? Oh, there he is. Okay. Yeah, and it looks like it's Piercy. But so he's part of that group of scouts that is providing that valuable information. And I don't know if you know this, David McConaughey gives some information to General Copeland that is sent to General Meade prior to the battle, and General Meade sends back to David McConaughey a thank you from the Army for supplying this information from his scouts. We don't have any information about his activities, but he's on the list, James Pierce. Of course, at the time of the Civil War, Tillie Pierce is going to school at the Gettysburg Female Institute. And let me see where I got that. Okay. And she, in her book, she describes what it's like to be in the town during the first part of the year and all the scares that are occurring. But here she says on June 26, we were having our regular literary exercises on Friday afternoon at our seminary when the cry reached our ears. Rushing to the door and standing in the front portico, we beheld in the direction of the theological seminary a dark, dense mass moving towards our town. Our teacher, Mrs. Eyster, at once said, "Children, run home as quickly as you can." It did not require repeating. I am satisfied some of the girls did not reach their homes before the rebels were in the streets. As for myself, I had scarcely reached the front door when, on looking up the street, I saw some of the men on horseback. I scrambled in, slamming shut the door, and hastening to the sitting room, peeping out between the shutters. What a horrible sight they were. Human beings, clad almost in rags, covered with dust, riding wildly pell-mell down the hill towards our house, shouting and yelling most unearthly cursing, brandishing their revolvers and firing right and left. And, in another part in her book, she actually talks about this building where she goes to school, and she mentions, "With pleasant recollections, I bring to mind the Young Ladies' Seminary on the corner of High and Washington Street. Here I received my instruction. Here, in the bright and happy flush of young womanhood, I was graduated and given my diploma. Within these same walls had been placed some of the wounded and dying heroes of the struggle." And that is like the only source that we have for this building being used as a hospital. Undoubtedly it was. But, these civilian accounts give us some insight sometimes into things we wouldn't know about otherwise. Okay. Oh. And then, of course, we have this whole scenario in her book, which, probably the first time I read it, I'm sure you guys know I have an affection for Jenny Wade. The first time I read it, I was horrified by this. But on June 26, upon the report of, and just previous to the raid, the citizens had sent their horses out of the Baltimore Pike as far as the cemetery. There, they were to be kept until those having the care of them were signaled that the enemy was about, when they were to hasten so fast as possible in the direction of Baltimore. Along with his party, Father sent our own horse in charge of the hired boy we had then living with us. I was very much attached to this animal, for she was gentle and very pretty. I had often ridden her. The cavalry referred to came so suddenly that no signal was given. They overtook the boys with the horses, captured them, and brought them all back to town. As they were passing our house, my mother beckoned to the raiders, and some of them rode over to where she was standing and asked what was the matter. Mother said to them, "You don't want that boy. He is not our boy. He is only living with us." One of the men replied, "No, we don't want the boy. You can have him. And we only are after the horses." About that time, the boy's sister, who had been standing short distance off, screamed at the top of her voice to Mother, If the Rebs take our Sam, I don't know what I will do with you folks." Thus, holding us responsible for her brother Sam's safety, even in times like that. Duh. You sent a 13-year-old boy on a horse to ride away from Confederate cavalry that are firing at him with pistols? Yes, I hold you responsible for it. Jeez. Mother assured her that they were only after the horses and after their Sam, not after their Sam. Well, according to Georgia Wade, who obviously read Tillie Pierce's book and was upset by it, she, in 1917, when John Wade Johnson interviews her, gives a different version of the account. They have to go down to the square of Gettysburg. So Jenny has to go get her mother. And do you know where her mother is? Caring for Georgia that had just given birth to a child an hour earlier. And they have to leave the house, go to the square of Gettysburg, talk to Colonel White, and get Sam released from custody, who's been captured by the Southern Army. It's a totally different version than Tillie tells. And anyway, what are we upset about anyway? It's a war. our pet horse. So anyway, maybe I'm being a little hard on Tillie. But let me read the rest of it. Okay. Because I'm sure you'll agree that I'm not hard on her. Father went, so eventually Tillie they talk to the father, and he goes up to the square to talk to Colonel Elijah White. And they mention him by name. He's the commander of the 35th Virginia Battalion of Cavalry, and he's in charge of the detachment that just came into town and took the horses. Father went up with them, but when he got before Colonel White, he was informed by the officer that he understood his father was a black Republican. So black that he was turning black. Also, he understood that he had two sons in the Union Army who he supported, supposed had taken much from the South. And so they're not giving the horse back. And then she says this: the information given to the rebels, we afterwards learned, was the act of Sam's sister referred to above. I am afraid her sympathies were not as much for the Union as they should have been. She certainly manifested an unkind disposition towards our family, who had been doing all they could for her brother. It would surprise a great many to learn who this person was. But as no detraction is intended, I will dismiss the subject at once. Okay, she's talking about Jenny Wade. So again, I'm going to side with Jenny. You may side with Tillie, but I'm siding with Jenny. Fascinating stuff. Just fascinating stuff about, the situation in town. Excuse me, though. Jenny has two brothers in the Union Army also. And one of her brothers, she was sewing his uniform when the rebels came into town, and he fled from the rebels also, to get out of town. Of course, he's wearing a uniform, so he would have been taken prisoner. So it's fascinating. And I just think it's interesting that Georgia feels the need to retaliate in the book written in 1917 about Tillie's account, written in 1888. Okay, enough of that. So on June 30th, the Union Army reaches Gettysburg, and General Buford's command comes into town. And she describes that in her account. Did I skip that account? Oh yeah, here it is. A little before noon on Tuesday, June 30th, a great number of Union cavalry began to arrive in town. They passed northwardly along Washington Street, and then turned towards the west on reaching Chambersburg Street, and passed out in the direction of the Theological Seminary. It was, to me, a novel and grand sight. I had never seen so many soldiers at one time. They were Union soldiers, and that was enough for me. For I then knew that we had protection, and I felt that they were our dearest friends. A crowd of us girls were standing on the corner of Washington and High Street as the soldiers passed by, desiring to encourage them who, as we were told before long, would be in the battle. My sister started to sing the old war song, Our Union Forever. And some of us who did not know the whole song of the piece kept repeating the chorus over and over again. This was sought to cheer our brave men, and we felt amply repaid when they saw our efforts were appreciated. And then she talks about how after the battle, some of the soldiers told us the singing was very good, but they would have liked to hear more than just the chorus. I think I could do the chorus too. You probably know the whole song. Yeah. Our Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah. Okay. So also, she tells this great story about the first day of the battle. And it's about the house across the street. And she says, during the first day of the battle and after our men retreated, a little girl was standing at the second-story window of the house opposite of ours. She had the shuttered bowed and was looking down into the street at the confusion below. Suddenly, a shell hit the wall just beside the shutter, tearing out a large hole and scattering pieces of brick, mortar, and plastering all around the room in which the little girl was standing. It entered the room and struck someplace in the room and rebounded out and fell into the street. Another ball is now placed in the wall to mark the place where the first one struck. I am here reminded of the fact that many persons, while walking or riding past this place and having their attention called to this shell sticking out of the wall, neatly encased in brick and mortar, think that it has been there just as it arrived on the first day of the battle. Shells were not quite so tidy in introducing themselves at that time. And of course, we're talking about the Methodist parsonage, and George Bergstresser is a Methodist minister, and the girl is Laura Bergstresser. And she mentions her by name in her account. And of course, there was an artillery shell placed in that building. And you know what? If it wasn't for this account by Tillie Pierce, we wouldn't know when that shell was placed. We still don't, but it was there in 1888, and it appears in this photograph by Henry Stewart. Of course, in 1910, they rip the front off of that building and replace it with a more modern front. But just next to the window, they pulled the shell out of the original wall, and they replaced and put the shell back in. So you can still see it there today, although it had a different front on that building at the time. And here's a 1916 postcard. And so I imagine the shell's like right there. Boy, would you let that much ivy get on your house? Wow. That's awesome. I just got that postcard, so I wanted to show it off. It has nothing to do with the program, really. Good. There's also, in front of that house, you might know, that there's a wayside exhibit, and there's a painting by Don Triani. And it shows a barricade that the Southern Army supposedly put across the street there at that location on July 2nd and 3rd. And you can see that's the Pierce house in the background of that wayside exhibit. So for homework, you can go out and check out the cannonball in the building. You can check out the wayside exhibit, and of course you want to look across the street at the Pierce house. We are very fortunate that the Tysons of Gettysburg took a series of photographs on Baltimore Street in July of 1863. November of 1863. They're trying to record the procession of the soldiers to the, the citizens to the Soldiers' National Cemetery. And in this view, we have a print made from the original negative in our collection. So it's in really high resolution. And during the first day of the battle, the Southern Army captured the town. And of course, we're going to talk about how Tillie is taken to Little Round Top and is not here at the time. But the Southern Army occupy the edge of the town during the battle. And this photograph gives us a good glimpse of the buildings at the edge of the town, like Rupp's Tannery, the Farnsworth House, Harvey Sweeney's house, the Homan House, the Banner House, the Anna Garlick House, and the Shriver House, and the Shriver House and the Pierce House. Let me see. That's the Garlick's house. Okay, so Pierce House is up here, and this is the Shriver House. I have a thing that shows you which is which. So this is the attic window in the George Shriver house. And it almost appears as if there's no door or window in it at that time in November. Maybe they hadn't replaced it yet. But all these buildings in the edge of the town are filled with sharpshooters. And according to Tillie's account, her father at different times went up to the garret of their house. And remember I showed the map before? There's a space between the Shriver house and the Pierce house. And he's looking out his attic window through the attic window of the Shriver house, and he's watching the sharpshooters. The south wall of the house had a number of portholes knocked into it, through which the rebels were firing at our men. All at once, one of the sharpshooters threw up his arms and fell back upon the garret floor. His comrades ran quickly to his assistance, and for a time being, they were apparently greatly excited and moved rapidly about. A short time afterwards, they carried a dead soldier out the back way and through the garden. So he says, and Tillie Pierce says that her father told her that a sharpshooter was killed in the Shriver attic, which is just fascinating. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But again, here's a different view of it. And again, you can see the Shriver house window and the Pierce house. You can see the back porch of the Pierce house over there. And we think like this is the bowling alley associated with the George Shriver house. Here's a colorized version of it. I know sometimes people like to see the colorized versions of things. Although, the black and white colorization has problems with the color purple and, trying to differentiate the different colors, but you get a good idea what it looked like. And there's a closer up view of those houses. And again, all these houses are filled with sharpshooters during the battle. Of course, I'm very fond of the Farnsworth house. Woody Christ did this wonderful drawing of these houses in the report that he wrote for Craig Hafner when he did the research on the house. And you can really, really see some interesting details, like the back porch of the Pierce house. And again, we think that's the bowling alley on the back of the Shriver house. And you see the Farnsworth house in a row. That's just, that really makes it a little bit easier to understand. Also, do you know there's a letter written by John Rupp, who lives at Rupp's Tannery, a week and a half, 2 weeks after the battle, written to his sister in Baltimore, his sister-in-law. And in it, he talks about the sharpshooters killed in the battle. 2 up in Mr. G. Shriver's house next to the Pierces. So he's talking about the Southerners that were killed in the fighting. So he says in this letter, 2 were killed in the Shriver house. So here's an 1863 letter that confirms the account that Tillie Pierce puts in her book in 1888. And that is not something that happens to us a lot where we can confirm this kind of information. So it's just wonderful that it's in the letter. Of course, he also talks about he also mentions in the letter that Jenny Wade was kneading bread in a dough tray when she was killed, which is really, one of the first sources for that. So you probably know the story. I'm assuming since you came and everybody knows a little bit about Tillie Pierce. Her mother and father become concerned with her safety during the first day of the fighting. And the next door neighbor, Henrietta Weichert, who's married to George Weichert, the house where the sharpshooters are in the attic, she goes over to the Pierces and says that she's going to go to her father's, Jacob Weichert, who lives down the Tawnytown Road, and get her family to safety. So Tillie goes with the Weicherts, or the Shrivers, Henrietta, and they go to her father's farm down the Tawnytown Road. And in the book, there's a great description of how they get in a wagon and ride down the Tawnytown Road. And of course, we have the Warren map of the battlefield, and you can follow their route down to, it's actually right there, the Weichert farm. And on the way, she gives us one interesting detail. And again, when I read these accounts, I'm looking for things that confirm things we already know. But she says that as they're driving, a wagon comes past them, and in it is the body of General John Fulton Reynolds, who had been killed in the first day's fighting, taken to the George house, and then put in a wagon and taken down the Tawnytown Road. We know that because we have accounts of men in the 2nd Army Corps closer to Tawnytown who are moving up that road, and account after account after account talks about Reynolds' body being brought past them in this wagon. And she mentions it in her account. And in the 1888 version of her book, there's this illustration of General Reynolds, which is not in the 1889 version that's later reprinted. So they end up being going to the Weichert family. Oh, it's this one. Do you know there's a guy named Jacob Weichert who lives on the Tonytown Road who is not related to the Jacob Weichert that lives beside him? Long story that we're not going to get into. Just say, if somebody asks you about it, just say, I don't know, Weicherts, and more Weicherts. But here's the Jacob Weichert farm, her father. Yeah, this Weichert is from Maryland, the son of George Weichert. So, but this is Jackie White's property. And of course, this is where the Hoffmans live today. And I mentioned Stan Clark lived there for a time. But this house still stands, and Tillie is taken to that house. And there's some great accounts in her book. There's just story after story after story told about the wounded soldiers. Now, I'm not going to get into all that. But let me just read one. The wounded began to come in greater numbers. Oh, obviously, she spends the night of July 1st there, and then July 2nd, there's heavy fighting on Little Round Top right near the back of the property of the house. So I would say this, if you're talking to somebody about it, out of the frying pan and into the fire. So they're sending her down there for safety, and they get there, and all of a sudden on July 2nd, they're in the middle of the battle. And the house becomes a hospital. So now the wounded began to come in greater numbers, some limping, some with their heads and arms in bandages, some crawling, others carried on stretchers or brought in ambulances, suffering, cast down and dejected. It was a truly pitiable gathering. Before night, the barn was filled with the shattered and dying heroes of the day's struggle. Whoop, that's not what I wanted to show. Okay, what happened? I thought I had a barn photo. Okay, I don't. Here's a map of the area. That evening, Becky Weichert, the daughter of the home, and I walked out to the barn to see what was transpiring there. Nothing before in my experience had ever paralleled the sight we then beheld. There were the groans and crying, the struggling and dying, crowded side by side while attendants sought to aid and relieve them as best they could. We were so overcome by the sad and awful spectacle that we hastened back to the house, weeping bitterly. So she just is in the middle of a massive hospital. And here's a map that appears in the 1888 version of the book showing some of the units and where they are on July 3rd. And, of course, the Jacob Weichert farm on the Tonytown Road. And there's, of course, a more modern picture of the house. And we are fortunate that we have a photograph from the 1890s. It could be 1888, but somewhere, I believe, in the early 1890s of the family, the part of the Weichert family that lived there at that time at that house. And here's the barn. I was just going to... the barn still stands. So hundreds of wounded soldiers were cared for in that barn, and it still stands. So I don't know if Jerry Hoffman's here somewhere, but if you make friends with him, he'll take you into the barn. It is, to me, that kind of thing is just an experience to actually see something like that. And here's the Elliott burial map of the battle. From 1864, and it shows where soldiers are buried around. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't show you where the house is, but we're talking about the house being like right here. And look at those soldiers buried around the house. And they're buried across the street. And that field has got to be where we're talking about. I often think about that. In the 1970s, there was a reenactment in that field, I remember. But can you imagine? Now, these soldiers are moved 10 years later, theoretically, the Southerners, and the Northerners, 4 months after the battle. Tillie mentions General Meade. General Meade stopped by the Weichert house and got a drink of water out of the well. She also mentions, of course, Stephen Weed dying in the house and talks about a conversation she had with him on the evening of July 2nd, and he died sometime that night. When she went back to visit him on July 3rd, he was dead. And again, people have questioned whether this is true or whether she's talking to someone else and just later remembers it as being General Stephen Weed. But, it's in her account. And again, if you take nothing away, because, sometimes I do diss Tillie, I think her account is one of the most honest accounts that I've seen. So I tend to side with her. And in the one article in 1889, Mrs. Alleman's statement that General Weed died at Jacob Weikert's house is correct and can be verified by the highest authority. In the newspaper, which is the Gettysburg newspaper, they don't tell you what the highest authority is. But there you go. Now, one thing that's interesting is in her account, and even Fraz questions this. She says at some point she goes out behind the house and there are Confederate soldiers coming around the side of Big Round Top. And she says that somebody yelled, "Here come the Pennsylvania Reserves." And she says that the Pennsylvania Reserves charge across the property in her sight and are fighting with the Confederates on the back side of the house behind the property. One thing I'd like to mention is that it is open all the way from the house to the base of Little Round Top. It's open fields. Today, it's all wooded. Secondly, that there was part of the Pennsylvania Reserves that did cross that property and did fight against the Southerners on Big Round Top. But it wasn't the Pennsylvania Reserves that charged off of Little Round Top across the Valley of Death. It was the 9th and 10th Pennsylvania Reserves that are going into position at the base of Big Round Top. So she probably did see that, and then later is just kind of, it gets mixed up with the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, Company K, that her brother was a part of, and that accounts for the confusion. But I tend, again, to side with her. On July 5th, she actually tours part of the battlefield with George Kitzmiller. How's it work? Becky Weikert, who is the sister of Henrietta, and Tillie go on a tour of the Valley of Death with George Kitzmiller. George Kitzmiller, who's a lieutenant in Company K, later marries Becky Weikert. And so here he is in a Company K photograph. And her account of bodies laying all around, it's just really good in the book. Now, one thing is interesting. Here is the 1889 illustration of the farm and the fighting and Big and Little Round Top in the background. And here is the 1888 version. So again, I'll bet you nobody knew this. I didn't know it until I compared them. We have 2 original copies of the 1888 version. I'm guessing that the illustrator had to copyright and they had to redo the illustrations in the book. And so the version we see is different than the version in the original book. Do you see the house is a lot different? So that's all the illustrations are slightly different. To me, that kind of stuff is just fascinating to me. And again, look how accurate that house is. You can see it from that. Maybe the illustrator had a copy of that photograph. I don't know. Or went out to the spot himself to draw it. How else would you have it that accurate? Here's another illustration, Rebel Sharpshooters on a Big Round Top, that's in the original 1888 book, but not in the 1889 book that has been reprinted and that we all have. So if you haven't seen that, and again, how would you ever see this unless you looked at the original 1888 copy? Get on eBay, see if you can find an original copy. And then, of course, I had to tell you that probably my favorite quote by Tillie Pierce is about the aftermath of the battle. So on July 7th, the Weikerts, Henrietta Shriver, they decide to leave her dad's home and go back to town where she'll be reunited with her parents that had stayed at the house in town. And she rides a wagon down the 2010 road and then across the fields because the 2010 road is unpassable. As it was impossible to travel on the roads on account of the mud, we took to the fields. While passing along, the stench arising from the field of carnage was most sickening. Dead soldiers, swollen to almost twice their natural size, lay in all directions. Stains of blood frequently met our gaze, and all kinds of army accoutrements covered the ground. Fences had disappeared. Some buildings were gone, others ruined. The whole landscape had been changed, and I felt as though we were in a strange and blighted land. And you might know that one of my good friends who's passed away, Greg Coco, wrote a book called Strange and Blighted Land about the aftermath of the battle. And if you didn't know that, that's a quote from Tillie Pierce's book. If you want to buy Tillie Pierce's book, we sell it in a gift shop. I don't even know how much we sell for. I'm thinking it's $15. Also, our publications crew, we have recently reprinted 2 other books on the battle that are for sale in our gift shop, and I have annotated them. Maybe one day we'll redo Tillie Pierce's book, and I'll annotate that book. Don't worry, I'll be nice to Tillie in the annotations. Good, except about Jenny Wade. So here's some other books written about Tillie Pierce. I like this one. The pictures in this one are really, really good, and I have it up here if you want to see it. But I really like that one. But it's basically Tillie Pierce's story just retold, in a more manageable fashion. And also, you might know that there's a book, it's really a long poem called Thunder at Gettysburg that came out in the 1970s that's about Tillie Pierce's account. To me, it's more for children, and they sanitized it too much, I think. Because the blood and guts is what really got me about Tillie's account in the first place. And then you might know there is a video later made into a CD. You can find this on YouTube, I think, and it was done by Greystone. So again, Craig Hafner, who's the producer of Greystone and had the Greystone's American History Store and did Civil War Journal, made a documentary about Tillie Pierce. And it's been a while since I watched it, but I am one of the historians that talks about Tillie Pierce in the documentary. So, and here, I guess this is he also did an audio book. But I think you can find it on the internet, the video. And if you want to, do some stuff for homework, you might go and walk around the area where Tillie lived. In front of her house, there's a wayside exhibit. We just replaced the wayside exhibit with a nice new picture on it just this last month. So this is an old version of it. And of course, there's a Tillie Pierce house inn, a bed and breakfast. You could stay there if you wanted and check out the house. Well, that's it. Well, thank you guys for listening to my program.